Final Girl is a solo horror board game which is very thematic, and a bad dice roll can lead to a very brutal ending for your favorite character. Some people have claimed the game involves too much luck, but in my opinion there is a lot of strategy and mitigation that help bend the odds in your favor. If you're losing too often in Final Girl, it might also be that you're forgetting about some easy to miss rules. Today I'm going over 10 rules that people tend to forget while playing Final Girl. Missing some of these might explain why the game feels too difficult or random to you. Number 1. The killer doesn't move unless they have a boot icon. This is probably the most overlooked rule of them all. Even seasoned gamers tend to forget about it once in a while. I blame some of the icon choices of the game for that. If the game tells you the killer attacks you or a victim, it doesn't necessarily say they will move toward you first. No move means they might not attack at all. This can change the whole game. My first couple games I was destroyed, not realizing that Dr. Fright doesn't move as part of his killer action. Only with the boot. This is true for the large majority of enemies in the game. Number 2. You can discard during the action phase to gain time. If there are cards you don't intend to use during your turn, you can either keep them for next turn or discard them for time. This literally buys you time for the current turn or increases your currency to gather items for the next turn. Think carefully about that one card in your hand. If you do not plan to use it this turn, will it be useful next turn? Or would you rather convert it into one additional point for purchasing something more powerful for next turn? This can be a very efficient way to turn the odds in your favor in Final Girl. Number 3. You can use melee weapons when you retaliate. Retaliate and other reaction cards are some of the most powerful actions in the game, generally allowing you to hurt the killer with limited downside. But they're of course even more potent if used in combination with a weapon. Note that you can only use a melee weapon such as a knife or a machete. Number 4. When moving the killer, if there is a tie for distance, the killer will go after the highest number of victims, not the final girl. In some cases, of course, the killer will specifically move in the direction of the final girl. But when he targets both the victims and the final girl, he will move toward the place with the most victims. The final girl does not count as a victim in this calculation. This can be a very strategic way to get out of the way of the killer, or on the contrary, get closer to them, depending on your plan. Number 5. You can win the game even if you die. An example of this use case is if the killer attacks you and you use Retaliate. Even if the Retaliate card does not negate all damage to you, you get to also do your own damage to the killer. Specifically, imagine you play the Retaliate action card. You get 1 star, so you reduce 3 damage to 1. That damage is enough to flip your last heart token, and it's blank. You still get to damage the killer. If their own heart token is blank, you both die, which is considered a victory in Final Girl. A pretty thematic one too. Number 6. You get additional dice to roll when you or the killer are close to being dead. This rule, known as the adrenaline rush, gives you an additional die for all your horror rolls when you only have 1 heart left. It applies to the killer's health as well. If they only have 1 heart left, you get 1 additional die. Meaning you get 2 additional dice if both you and the killer only have 1 heart left. It's fairly easy to remember when your health is involved, but people tend to forget their additional die when it's the killer's health that's close to 0. Number 7. You can only rearrange items when you acquire a new one or during the upkeep phase. There are only limited ways you can rearrange your hand and backpack items, and by the way, this means sometimes you have no choice but to discard items. There are 2 moments when you can rearrange your items though, and it can help your strategy to remember those. Either when you acquire a new item, for example after a successful search, or during the upkeep phase. Here again, it's critical to plan ahead and think of what you'll do with the items next turn. Note that vehicles like the bike actually require you to use both hands, so you might have to drop your weapon when you plan to use such vehicles. Number 8. When you move into the finale, if the Dark Power card hasn't been revealed yet, reveal it then. Okay, this one's not going to make the game easier for you, granted. But it's a rule people tend to forget. Number 9. When drawing from the item deck, you do not reveal the top card after you draw. That is, unless the search card specifically instructs you to do so. Number 10. A victim only panics if one of them was killed this turn and they are in the same space as the killer. I tend to either forget to panic victims entirely or to panic too many of them. In order for a victim to panic, at least 1 victim needs to have died this turn, and only victims in the same space as the killer do panic. They are not necessarily in the space where the initial victim died, by the way. And as a bonus, number 11, don't forget the rules of ambiguity. Hey, I said only 10 rules, but here's possibly the most essential one. The goal of Final Girl is to have fun in a thematic way. This means that if something ambiguous happens, You can choose what outcome would be the most thematic, that's called the rule of abject realism. Or if you like pain, you can also choose the one that's the worst for you, that one is the rule of infinite evil. Last but not least, you might want the outcome that's the funniest to you, the rule of never-ending hilarity. Personally, I find that the most funny outcome is also the most thematic one, so that's the one I typically choose. Last but not least, if you want to be really crisp clear on Final Girl rules, I have an FAQ on my blog, I'll leave a link in the description below. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.